Welcome to Let's Get Writing. I'm your host, Catherine Taylor, and we're coming to you from central Newfoundland, Canada. Now, this is a show all about the writing process from creation to publication. And here is where you find the stories behind the stories and meet the people who write the books. Now, my guest today was born in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, and grew up in Colonet and Haricot. His passion for trains and all rail-related things was introduced to him by his father at a very young age, and he still rides the rails and photographs trains at every opportunity. Well, please join us as we look back at the days of rail in Newfoundland and meet my guest, Kenneth Pieroway. I'm going to bring him right up on the screen. Hello, Kenneth. How are you? Oh, just a second here. There we go. When I'm my own technician and host, it takes a little bit. I think we can hear you now.
Great. Thanks, Catherine, for having me
on. So you're in CBS, which to Newfoundlanders is Conception Bay South.
That's correct.
Joining us from there. And your books are all about the trains in Newfoundland. And of course, as we know, trains and streetcars don't exist here anymore, but at one time they were quite much a part of our fabric and how we moved around and how we made friends even. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write these books? I'm just going to bring the images up while you do that.
Well, Catherine, the first book, Streetcars of St. John's, that was inspired by my mom. Mom was a Memorial University student back in the 1930s. And the only way to get around St. John's at the time was using streetcar system. So later years, back in the 1970s, Mom would talk to my sister and I, and she'd tell us these stories about these little red Bernie streetcars that ran around St. John's and all the different stops they'd make. So it was part of my upbringing to learn about these streetcars. And that was inspired by my other parent, my dad. Dad loved trains, and growing up in Corner Brook in the mid-1960s, he would take me down to the station when the passenger train would arrive. And at the time, we had two passenger trains. One would arrive around, say, 2:30, 3 o'clock, and another around 4, eastbound and westbound. Dad would take me down. He knew some of the engineers. The trains at the time were painted in a beautiful olive green paint scheme, and I just fell in love with it. That's where it all started.
That's where it all started. And, you know, when I saw your book come across my desk, I spent a period of time where I worked with Via Rail Canada in the public relations, corporate affairs, and as a spokesperson. And in that position, I got to find out that there are a lot of people like you all over the world that absolutely adore trains and train travel and all aspects. And I encountered many of them during that job. And when the book came across my desk, I was like, oh, this is like a little step back in time for me to reconnect with that period and explore the fascination that people have with trains. So what do you think it is? Why are people so passionate about trains?
Catherine, for one thing, you know, if you think about trains, it goes back to a simpler time in our lives. You know, you're talking pre-internet, pre-cell phones. People weren't immediately reachable. For example, to get across the island, even in the late 1960s, when we still had the Caribou, which was also known some as the Bullet, it would take like 22 to 24 hours. Now, I mean, you know, people just fly everywhere. But one thing about train travel, it encourages conversation and encourages reaching out to people, because you sit at a coach seat and you're lying beside somebody. For example, if it's in Newfoundland, it could be a person that was on their way to Port aux Basques. And you could be from, like where I'm from, here now in Chamberlains. And you'd sit next to that person, and of course you'd exchange names and pleasantries, but train travel encourages communication. And it's so relaxing. You sit back, you watch the countryside go by, you go to the dining car and you have a lovely meal in the diner. And in Newfoundland, apparently the best meal served anywhere in the province and the island at the time was on board the Newfoundland Express. When trains arrived, like say at a station in Gambell, it was a big deal. People would come down to the station to watch everybody get off the train, seeing who's traveling, who's coming, who's going. And another thing too, I've discovered, when people rode our trains here, they dressed in their Sunday best. The ladies wore beautiful dresses and hats and coats. and gentlemen had their finest suits on. And when you went to the dining car, it was a really formal affair. You had silverware, you had fine china, and expertly cooked meals. It was just a fun way to travel. And having gone across Canada twice myself on VS Canadian, I can attest to that. I mean, it's just such a relaxing way to travel. By the end of your journey, you know pretty much everybody on board the train.
Well, I'm sure you would. There's no question with your interest and your personality. And when you say that, the dining car is particularly special.
Mhm.
And at times, depending on the size of your party, you don't know who you might be dining with at all. They could be from anywhere in the world, and you're looking out and seeing the scenery pass by. And I think I this in Europe, and I think you've done it in many places in the world. Tell us a little bit about it. I haven't done the train trip that you had done in Canada. I only had gone from Halifax to Montreal. But how did it differ for you if you were taking that train trip in Canada and maybe over in Europe, taking it?
Uh, the difference with the European trips, where Europe is so small, most major cities are reached within a couple of hours. And I know the first time we went to Europe, that was back in 1992, and we had a Eurail pass, which means we could travel on as many trains as we wanted in X number of days. Catherine, the rule of thumb is that at any given train station in Europe, there's a train going somewhere. And so you could basically go and at the last minute decide. I know we were in Lucerne, Switzerland, and we'd seen everything that we wanted to see. We were on our way to Bruges in Belgium. But anyway, we had basically an afternoon of not really a whole lot to do. So we went to the train station and we looked up and we saw that there was a train going to a place called Basel, which is also in Switzerland. We have a friend, Basel. So we said, let's just jump on the train to Basel to tell Basel that we could do this. And that's what we did. We went to Basel and we had a lovely supper. And then we got back on another train. And by the next morning, we were in Bruges, in Belgium. The trains in Europe, too, I mean, you could literally set your clock by them. I remember pulling into Graz, Austria, and I think our arrival time was 11:37. When a train stopped, you could see the clock just outside the window, 11:37, right on the button. It was amazing.
Oh, that was that was the bane of my existence, was the on time tracking of the trains in Canada. It didn't always work like that.
No, that's right. No.
But you painted a beautiful image when you said that people dressed up to go on trains and wore their Sunday best. And I noticed in many of the images, and I want to bring some of them up here and show them in the screen, that people sitting by the side of the tracks, I think there was a gentleman with a hat on and a suit and just sitting maybe on his suitcase. But in so many of the images, there were people. And it kind of brought back memories to me of times that maybe times when I grew up and my parents, things that they did. So it is nostalgic. Maybe tell us a little bit about some of these photos here.
Okay, sure. Well, this particular image now, this was taken on June the 19th, 1956 by Robert J. Sandusky. Robert is widely considered to be Canada's top railway historian and photographer, and he graciously wrote the foreword for my book. But this train here now, she's just left Port aux Basques and it's pulling into St. Andrews. And if you notice the color, at the time, all these train cars in 1956 were painted olive green, which was CN's new color. Just 5 or 6 years earlier, each one of those cars were a beautiful red, which was the color of the Newfoundland Railway. And in my Stephenville Crossing shot, you'll actually see the cars in that color.
Well, I'm just going to go through. They might not be in order, but that's a steam locomotive.
That's a steam locomotive. That was one of the Mikado engines. And this train is the number 2 eastbound. And that's the same train that you saw in the previous St. Andrews picture, taken by Robert Sandusky. This is the Port aux Basques yard. And in the background, I don't know if you noticed, you can see the stack of the ship. That's the SS Cabot Strait. And that's how people at the time came from Nova Scotia or anywhere in the mainland to get to know. So that train would leave there and it would arrive probably 25 hours later in St. John's. This is at Harry's Brook. This is a beautiful picture. It's one of my favorites, actually. In the summer of 1956, a group of rail fans left Montreal. It was an organized trip, and they came to Newfoundland because it was the last summer of steam operations. And so here we have 2 steam engines pulling a passenger train, meeting one of our brand new diesels head on. And the gentleman, I actually know the gentleman in the picture. His name is Bert Kelly. He was a conductor. And my mother-in-law discovered that. Said, "Oh, look, that's Bert Kelly." So that's another nice thing about these pictures. You find people that you knew.
There we go. Diesel.
And this is a diesel freight train. This train now is moving on. It's another Robert Sandusky shot. It's taken at Harry's Brook, and the train is pulling onto the main line. And the steam passenger train that you saw in the previous picture had already gone on. But these are the color of the diesels when I first discovered trains, and I love them. This is an interesting shot. This is another Robert Sandusky. This is from July the 2nd, 1969. It's the very last eastbound cargo. So when that train leaves Port aux Basques, it'll arrive in St. John's the next morning, July the 3rd at 8 o'clock. But that's the last passenger train passing from that.
And as a side note, my parents took me to Bishop's Falls when I was very young. I was like, why am I doing this? Put me on the train and sent me back up to Grand Falls so I could say that I rode the Newfie Bullet.
Yep.
Which I did. And for people who don't know, the Bullet was called the Bullet because it wasn't fast. It was unpredictable at best.
Apparently, it was a nickname given by some American servicemen because it was so slow. But it's interesting enough, Catherine, the Bullet, even though it was scheduled for 22 hours, they did have some trial runs where the train could cross the island in as little as 17, including all stops. So it wasn't slow as
it wasn't always. No. But actually, I've seen some shots, I think it was Mont Lingard had them in one of his books, where the gaff topsails, and I've been up there through the gaff, the snow that they cut for these trains to go through, in some ways it was amazing that they even got across the island. It was
well, the gaff topsails was definitely one of the trouble spots, not only just for seeing in Newfoundland, but for the whole country, actually. And it was a decision to go across the gaff topsails that probably led to the end of the entire system, because the cost of snow clearing was so expensive that it negated any savings by going across the topsail versus heading up north towards Halls Bay.
Right. Let's see, we got a few more shots here. Oh, that's so scenic. I mean, we did talk about the scenery.
This is one of my favorite shots. This is from Robert Palmer. Robert's an internationally renowned rail photographer. He shot all over Europe, North America, but he made a trip to Newfoundland in June of 1984. And this is near the Isthmus. And it's just, I used this shot because I wanted to show how close the tracks actually came to the Trans-Canada Highway. So for most of the island, the railway, I should say the TCH parallels the railway, and except for between Deer Lake and Badger. It's 80 miles across the gaff topsails.
Done that run on a side-by-side. It's a good run. And and look, right by the water, right by the ocean.
Right by the water. This was taken, I think it's June the 22nd, 1967 by James A. Brown. James is another well-known, well-respected, one of the greatest authorities on Canadian railroads and one of the greatest photographers that this country has ever had. And James actually became a good friend of mine. Sadly, he's since passed away. But this was at Kelligrews Beach, and that's the train from Carbonear that's making its way back to St. John's. Little small G8 diesels there. But it's what I like about this, the people in the picture, where are they now?
Oh, yeah, maybe I'll go back there for you. Sorry about that. I jumped ahead.
There's three looks like children there on the wharf, and you've got the overturned gurney. Then you've got a gentleman who's probably their dad just watching the train go by. But I don't know if they've ever seen this picture or seen themselves, because that was close to 60 years ago, 55 years ago. Yep.
They'd be well grown up by now. And then we'll move on to the, there we go. Look at that. Now, is that like in the Humber? I don't know. I'm guessing. That
is at Kitty's Brook East, it's called. And that's from my very first train ride. That was April the 20th, 1987. I found out that you could still ride a train over the gaff topsails. So my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, we drove to Bishop Falls. We jumped on this train. We were the only passengers for the whole 138-mile journey. And that's at Kitty's Brook. And this is the spring runoff. What is interesting, Catherine, when we left Bishop Falls, it was spring conditions. We get up in the gaff, and there's probably still 10 feet of snow. Now we're on the downward side of the gaff, and the melt has started again. And by the time we get to Cornerbrook, there was no snow at all.
Cool. And that's typical of Newfoundland. The weather
Exactly.
is very variable depending
Yeah.
on where you are or time of day. Oh, Holyrood.
Yeah, this is a great shot. This was also taken in 1967, June. It's by my friend John Fracing. And actually, where the train man is leaning out and he's got some train orders, that's the same train that you actually saw in the Keller's picture a little bit earlier. So there's a gentleman in the middle. He's walking up, getting ready to light a cigarette. And the station agent is putting his hand out to take the train order. So a lot of human interest going on in this one.
And a
And of
lot of
course,
skill.
yes,
A lot
definitely.
of skill to make that pass off, really. And
Exactly,
just
because the train kept moving. So
yeah.
if you didn't make the contact, I don't know what they would have done. No,
No, well, they couldn't go off the track. Well,
no,
they have one direction to go.
that's right.
You do know that. Oh, beautiful, beautiful picture. Look at the road there.
This is a beautiful picture. That's Riverside Drive in Corner Brook, and the train is almost into Corner Brook. That was September the 30th, 1988. That is the very last scheduled mixed freight train to ever run in Newfoundland. It's engineer Pat O'Reilly. He's leaning out the window waving. And just behind him is a videographer by the name of Steve Bradley. And Steve was an Air Canada pilot at the time, and he basically recorded a video called The Last Days of the Newfoundland Railway. A beautiful, beautiful shot. And this is the very last eastbound train into St. John's, ready to leave Corner Brook, and I'm sorry, ready to leave Clarendon. And again, it's another picture by Steve Bradley, and it's just notice the clouds. It captured the somberness of the mood because this was a sad day for railroaders and rail fans and Newfoundlanders as a whole. We lost our rail system, which ran for 107 years, and this was the last train into St. John's.
And when you think of it, like the fact that now everything has to be on the highways here in Newfoundland, it's if we had perhaps not that narrow gauge, maybe the trains would still be running here, and it would have been nice in many respects, because when you travel, say even in Nova Scotia, the trains still have the tracks, and
Yes.
they still carry a lot of freight in and out, whereas here it's all on the highways, all on the roads. And
Catherine, that's an interesting point because even in the last summer of our operations, we had 2 trains a day, one going east and one going west, carrying roughly 80 containers each, give or take. And the containerization program was quite successful. But if you translate that to today, that's 160 trucks, 160 drivers, 160 tanks of fuel, plus the wear and tear that's on our highways. And in some research I did, I've read that one tractor trailer weighed down over a mile does the same amount of damage as 5,000 cars. So it takes 5,000 cars to run over that same piece of pavement to do the damage that one truck does. So it's there's a price to be paid. Yeah.
There is, don't we know it? But the railway came from England, and weren't they on narrow gauge at the time? Is that how we ended up with narrow gauge?
We wound up with narrow gauge a narrow gauge system. The fact that, well, first of all, we were a British colony. Britain provided us with some of the money to actually build our railway, but it was never intended to be a first-class line. It never was intended to be standard gauge, which is what's used throughout the rest of North America. And the only thing was, it's been said, the railway was never intended to be a first-class line, but the people that ran it were. All the railroaders, they were so devoted. They loved their jobs. They worked hard. The locomotives, the people aboard the passenger trains, like the service that they gave the passengers was excelled or unheard of anywhere else. Newfoundlanders put their heart and their soul, the ones that worked on the railway, into it. And it might have been substandard, but it was plus standard, by the way it was operated.
A lot of passion. And I know I did have the photo up, but here's the actual backwards to everyone. And the images in it, just to give you an idea, are stunning. And I can't capture that when I put them up on the screen. So it's such a beautiful book to read. And I know a lot of work. You mentioned some of the people you got photos from. How did you begin that task? It must have been enormous.
It goes back to Memorial University. I was working on a social work project at the time, and I was at the Center for Newfoundland Studies. And I found this book by Omer LaValle, who later actually I got some of his work. Omer had a book called Narrow Gauge Railways of Canada. And in it were pictures taken of Newfoundland in the 50s and the 60s. which I learned for the first time that these professional rail photographers came here. Anyway, I remembered their names, Robert Sandusky, James A. Brown, amongst others. So 20 years later, when I started to work on my first book, Rails Across the Rock, this was back in 2010, 2011, I said, oh, I'm going to see if these gentlemen are still around. So using Canada 411, I would pick up the phone and I would phone like a James A. Brown, who I heard was in Ontario. More often than not, I would actually get the actual photographer. And that's where it started. It started with reaching out to these guys by telephone. It started off with one image. A gentleman by the name of Jim Scribbins rode our passenger train in 1966. I wrote him a letter. He sent me one slide, and that was the start. By the time I finished, Catherine, I had well over 1,500 images from the top rail photographers all across Canada, all across the USA. And I got to say, these gentlemen were just that, gentlemen. They were so passionate and so kind to share their work. And their work speaks for itself. You've seen the pictures in the book. Right? It's just
Absolutely.
so beautiful. Captures Newfoundland as it looked like 50 and 60 years ago. It's amazing work.
And of course, I do want to mention Flanker Press because they publish these books, and
Yes.
and these they do a lot of books that reflect our history. And I know Jerry Cranford's there now, but his father Gary, that was sort of his passion when he envisioned Flanker Press,
Yes.
and boy, they sure are doing it. Yeah.
Well, one of their mottos is our authors make history.
Yes. Yeah. Well, now I want to move to the streetcars because they're in Toronto, but you know, at one time they were here, and you talked about that, and that's this book, Streetcars of St. John's. And again, you did something a little different. You were able to do something a little different with this book.
Okay, this book, it was done in a then and now format, Catherine. So what I did, the images that I collected, and I collected images from rooms, the City of St. John's archives, some people's private collections, provincial archives. People were just so good. And I got to give a shout out to the late Larry Dowie, who at the rooms. Larry was phenomenal in providing me and getting me some of these pictures. So what I did is basically I recreated the same shot that was taken, say, in 1939, as it looks exactly today. So the two pictures were side by side. And it was a great comparison because it showed not just how much St. John's changed, but also how much St. John's stayed exactly the same.
Actually, you did send me a couple of images, and I think I overlooked uploading them. So I'm just going to hold this up. You can see, for example, that would be more current, and then here would be back in the day.
Yes, in the exact same spot. And if you notice the building on the far right, there's only a couple of pieces left. So there's the original shot. So on the far right of that picture, when you look over at the new one, you can see that whole block has been taken down. But that's what's left from the original shot. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, the images in this book, and you dedicated each book. This one I think was dedicated to your mother. I believe this one, and the other one to your father.
Yeah.
There we go. Which I thought was, she was quite passionate about the streetcars, I believe.
Well, Mom was an educator by training. She was a teacher by training, and she also too became a social worker later in life. But Mom had great oratorical skills and great writing skills, and she would tell us these stories, and that's why it stayed with me. It's part of my whole upbringing. So, to honor my mom, both my parents are gone. To honor my mom, I released that book, and there's to my dad. And it's interesting that this week that you're showing up that picture because Dad served in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was overseas with Bomber Command, and so this being Veterans Week, it's a nice tribute to Dad, and to thank him for all he's done, and plus all these comrades. Because Catherine, the reason you and I are having this conversation today is because of what people like my dad and all those who served in World War II did.
And you're right. We are recording this show. Tomorrow will be Remembrance Day. The show will actually air a little later for folks who are watching, but we did record it on the 10th of November. Now, what's next? Actually, I should say you've written 4 books. These are the 2 most recent, but there were 2 that preceded these.
I did. My first book came out in 2013. It's called Rails Across the Rock, and it's a photo journey from Port aux Basques to St. John's, done in a then and now format. And my second one was called Rails Around the Rock, and it's this time it explored the Newfoundland branch lines, the Argentia branch, the Carbonaire branch, the Grand Falls Central Railway, the Buckens Railway, the Lewisport branch, the Bonavista branch, and the Stephenville branch. So it looked at the branches that expanded out from the main line that went from St. John's to Port of Basque. Um, I've got lots of ideas for the future, and I still have a lot of material that really needs to be seen. Uh, these images, a sad thing that's happening, Catherine, is a lot of these photographers are passing away. Just this summer, two of the gentlemen who contributed to my book and were friends of mine had passed away. And it's you get to know these people and know the goodness that's in them. And so that's a little bit sad. But the story has to be told, and time is running out to tell it. But I've got a lot of material left, so there could be something else in the works.
Well, we sure hope so, and I suspect there will be. But also, people can reach you by going to Facebook. I'll put
Yes.
the in our show notes for those of you who are watching this on TV. Go to my page at YouTube, Catherine Taylor TV, or Facebook, Catherine Taylor Media, and in those notes, I'll have links to Kenneth's Facebook pages. And that way you can keep up to date with all the current things that he's doing and sharing. Because I was on there. You've got a lot of great things on your Facebook pages.
Thank you. Yeah. I have two, my own personal one, and then I have one as a Newfoundland author. So both, lots of information on both.
Yeah, there is. And I'm sure, and when I was on there, I think I saw a site that was something railways or rails.ca. There are sites all over the world similar.
There's a whole legion of rail fans with different sites. One is called railpictures.ca, and I contributed to that one. I just had an image approved and posted that I'd taken myself. And Catherine, you were mentioned earlier about Flanker. If anyone is interested in obtaining any of my books, they can contact Flanker Press directly. Books are available at Kohl's, Chapters, Indigo, the Down Home, Costco. And they're going
anywhere
to be
fine books are sold. That's wonderful. Well, I really want to thank you so much. And there was something I took out of your book that I want to end this show with. But thank you, Kenneth, so much for your story. And it was, you said, Tom Hanks. It was a quote from the Polar Express movie. One thing about trains, it doesn't matter where they are going. What matters is deciding to get on. And on that note, we'll encourage viewers to check out trains whenever they can, wherever they can, and when they can't, check out your books.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on Let's Get Ready.